Buddy, back again with another reading hour. If you are just tuning in for the first time, because I believe this is the first one I'm going to put out on the regular True Crimes of the Empire / Turn Leftist podcast feed. So if you're hearing this for the first time, that may be why. But this is the reading hour series that I've been doing. These are live streams, and then I put out the audio afterwards. It's unedited, so please don't mind all the slip ups and flubs when I'm reading through. But basically, what I'm doing here is reading through 3 books, 20 minutes at a time. They differ, depending on what the selection of books is selected. I started with the Gladio book, and I had already finished one book. It was the Busy Worker's Handbook to the Apocalypse. I'm also reading through a Peter Dale Scott book currently, and also Western Marxism, the Domenico Losurdo book, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. So if you guys enjoy these, you can catch up on all the previous streams at youtube.com/@tcotepod/streams, where you can find them all in audio format on the Patreon at True Crimes of the Empire for just $1 a month. Or you can wait until I broadcast them all on the regular podcast feed. So, but that being said, I'm going to pick back up here with the Operation Gladio book. Now the Instagram is caught up, so we're going live here. All right, so picking back up with the Gladio book. This next section here is called Terror on a Train. On August 4th, 1974, another major terrorist incident occurred when a bomb exploded on the Italicus Rome-Munich Express as the train pulled out of a tunnel near the village of San Benedetto Val d'Asambro. 12 people were killed and 105 injured. This attack represented a reaction to the May 12th vote that abolished Italy's arcane divorce laws. The outcome represented a sharp rebuke to the Vatican and the Christian Democratic Party. Following the election, Gelli funneled black funds to Augusto Cauchy, who had commandeered the bombing. When the police traced the evidence to Cauchy, he fled, with Gelli's assistance, to Argentina. 16 years after the incident, Mario Tutti and Luciano Franchi, two members of Cauchy's criminal clan, received life sentences for their part in the train attack. So again, just to catch everyone up, Operation Gladio was a series of clandestine guerrilla groups composed of actual Nazis left over from World War II who were organized and funded and armed by the CIA in conjunction with the Vatican, the P2 Masonic Lodge in Italy. And through this network, they created the entire drug trafficking apparatus that still exists to this day and used the funds from it to fund all these illegal guerrilla militant operations and terrorist attacks that were then blamed on the left in Europe in order to basically create the fascist world order that we live under now. So this next section here is the master plan. In 1976, Gelli and other P2 officials drafted documents outlining their plans for the, quote, democratic rebirth of Italy. The plans called for the infiltration and control of all state institutions, all opposition groups, including the Italian Communist Party, the trade unions, the leading daily newspapers, and the national television stations. Sorry, just one second here. The drafters of the plan believed that this takeover could be accomplished by the expenditure of 40 billion lira, approximately $250 million in black funds. The overall objective was, quote, the establishment of a club where the best level of industry and financial sector leaders, members of the liberal professions, public officials and magistrates, as well as very few selected politicians are represented. Men who would constitute a real committee of trustees respecting those politicians who will take on the honor of implementing the plan. So yeah, they're basically just drawing up and implementing this plan to blackmail politicians. The people that are involved in this are pretty much every high-level politician in Italy and throughout Europe, but mostly Italy at this time, at least. Media figures, like, it runs so deep that pretty much every lead professional in any industry has some involvement with this operation or is being blackmailed by some operative of it in a way that gets their agenda done in every political area, in every area of industry. This is throughout the Cold War. The club would implement a series of electoral, judicial, and constitutional reforms in order to make the country more, quote, governable. National political life would be subordinated to an oligarchy with no formal political accountability, represented by the secret P2 Lodge. Here and not in state institutions, decisions would be made. Jelly and his Masonic brothers could pull a string and everything would fall into place. Once this system was established, Italy could be steered in the direction determined by P2's American controllers. The plans, as outlined in the P2 documents, quote, Memorandum sulla situazione italiana, Memorandum on the Italian Situation, and Piano di Rinascita Democratica, Plan of Democratic Rebirth, were found by the Italian police at the Fiumicino airport in Rome. They had been concealed within the false bottom of a suitcase belonging to Jelly's daughter. So this is like the level of operations they're going through. They have all these documents, and I should note that again, the only reason we know about most of these operations, Operation Gladio, the whole scandal, is because of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, in which the roster of all the Gladio operatives was discovered, and then this whole operation was kind of blown open. So again, this is not conspiracy theory. This is fact that has been proven by black and white documents. Also, in the suitcase was a top secret U.S. military dossier entitled, quote, Stability Operations, Intelligence, Special Fields, that had been published under the authority of General William Westmoreland, the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff. The dossier informed intelligence operatives of appropriate means of response to communist insurgencies. And of course, the purported ostensible purpose of this entire Gladio network of these guerrillas, these stay behind units, these secret armies and militants who would go on to assassinate communists, labor leaders, politicians who were too left wing, anybody who really didn't play along with the game here. The ostensible purpose was to prepare these stay behind armies in case of a Soviet invasion of Europe. But since they didn't actually have that, they had to find busy work, which was murderous work for these people. So the Moro kidnapping. This is Aldo Moro. On March 16th, 1978, Aldo Moro, Italy's prime minister, was kidnapped while on his way to parliament for the opening of debate on the newly formed Government of National Unity, a coalition of communists, socialists, and Christian Democrats. The incident occurred when a white Fiat with diplomatic plates pulled in front of his black limousine, forcing the driver to slam on the brakes. Two men from the Fiat and four other assassins who had been waiting on the sidewalk in Alitalia pilot uniforms opened fire on Moro's bodyguards, killing all five of them. Moro's policy of working with and bringing the communists into the government was denounced by both the USSR and the United States. But no one had been more outraged at the Italian Prime Minister's attempt at rapprochement than U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. In 1974, when Moro paid a visit to the United States, Kissinger warned him, quote, you must abandon your policy of bringing all the political forces in your country into direct collaboration, or you will pay dearly for it. And again, this is footnoted. That's footnote 22. That's something I keep saying about this book. It is one of the most heavily footnoted books I've ever read. So there are sources there is no shortage of sources for all of the things in this book. But also, this is another event that Matt Christman talked about in his Inebriated Past episode of Chapo Trap House on Operation Gladio, which is how I first found out about the entire thing. But he explains in pretty great detail the Aldo Moro kidnapping and, spoiler alert, his eventual death, and how this was blamed on left-wing militants, even though there would have been no motivation for them to do that, since he was trying to bring the left into a more, effective position, an official position in the government. And then what happened was the government turned much further right after this happened. So it was not in the left's interest to do this. It was actually in Gladio's interest, and it was, of course, Gladio operatives. Kissinger's threat had such a profound effect upon Moro, the prime minister became physically ill and contemplated retirement from government. The military secret service and acting prime minister Giulio Andreotti immediately blamed the left-wing terrorist organization Red Brigades for the kidnapping and proceeded to crack down on the left. And this is the common thread you will see throughout all these terrorist acts committed by these right-wing militants and secret Gladio operatives. It's always blamed on the left. And then there's always a huge crackdown on left-wing orgs, any left-wing activists, like any left-wing person. They will be rounded up by the hundreds, whereas the people who are actually guilty of committing these acts are often arrested, investigated, and then let go. 72,000 roadblocks were erected and 37,000 houses were searched. More than 6 million people were questioned in less than 2 months. While Moro was held captive, his wife Eleonora spent the days in agony together with her closest family and friends, even asking Pope Paul VI for help. And this is especially ironic because Pope Paul VI is like one of the head Gladio operatives. This next section here is called the Crisis Committee. Steve Pizenik, a former U.S. State Department hostage negotiator and international crisis manager, claimed that he played a quote critical role in Moro's fate. He had been sent to Italy on the day of the kidnapping by Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, who viewed Moro's project of accommodation with communists with great disdain. In Rome, Pizenik worked with a crisis committee headed by Francisco Cossiga, Italy's interior minister. Cossiga, who became Italy's prime minister in 1979 and president in 1985, had strong ties to Gelli and Gladio. And so Gelli here is Licio Gelli. It's Liscioggelli. If anybody wants to look him up, but he's like one of the main operators of Gladio as well. Gets in close with the Pope and like all these CIA agents. So another like notorious and dastardly individual in this book. Indeed, all of the officials who served on the crisis committee were members of P2, including Admiral Giovanni Torrisi, head of General Staff of the Defense, General Giuseppe Santovito, head of SIS-MI, Walter Pelosi, head of CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies, General Rafael Giudici, head of the Guardia di Finanza, and General Donato Loprete, Chief of General Staff of the Guardia di Finanza. Giulio Grassini, the head of the newly appointed Anti-Terrorism Inspectorate, was also a member of the lodge. And again, so P2 Lodge is like the Propaganda Due Lodge, the Masonic Lodge, and it's like one of the main organizing avenues for Gladio operatives, and one of their methods for connecting like high-level politicians with illicit drug dealers and gangsters and like all these underhanded individuals. It gives them all this like common meeting place, basically. And just to say, if you are a member of the P2 Lodge, you are absolutely a part of the Gladio operations. Throughout the investigation, Grassini remained in constant contact not only with the committee but also Gelli. On May 9, 1978, the committee forged a memo attributed to the Red Brigades stating that Moro was dead. Pizenik stated that the memo, which was leaked to the press, served a dual purpose: to prepare the Italian public for the worst, and to let the Red Brigades know that the state would not negotiate for Moro and considered him already dead. The decision was made in the fourth week of the kidnapping, when Moro's letters became desperate and he was about to reveal state secrets, Pizenik later testified. It was an extremely difficult decision, but the one who made it in the end was Interior Minister Francesco Cossiga, and apparently also Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti. When pressed about the committee's action, Pizenik added, quote, "We had to sacrifice Aldo Moro to maintain the stability of Italy." So, I don't think they make it exactly clear who kills him, uh, but it is obviously the group that they are calling the Red Brigades, even though it very much was not any left-wing organization that kidnapped him. This next section here is A Stone in the Mouth. In a cryptic article appearing in a May 1978 issue of Osservatore Politico, investigative journalist Carmine Mino Pecorelli drew a connection between the death of Moro and Gladio. Moro's body, he noted, had been left in the trunk of a car parked next to an ancient Roman amphitheater where runaway slaves and prisoners fought to the death in gladiatorial combat. Quote, who knows what there was in the destiny of Moro that his death should be discovered next to that wall? Pecorelli wrote, quote, the blood of yesterday and the blood of today. Interesting. In another article, Pecorelli wrote that Moro's kidnapping had been carried out by a, quote, lucid superpower and was inspired by the, quote, logic of Yalta. He described the crime as, quote, one of the biggest political operations carried out in recent decades in an industrialized country integrated into the Western system. In one of his last articles published on January 16, 1979, Pecorelli had written, quote, we will talk about Steve R. Pizenik, who participated for 3 weeks in the Interior Ministry's expert meetings, then returned to America before Moro was killed, and reported to Congress that the measures taken by Cossiga on the Moro affair were the best possible in the circumstances. Lot to mull over there. Several months after making these claims, Pecorelli was gunned down near his office on Via Orazio in Rome. The barrel of a gun had been shoved down his throat and the trigger pulled twice. As a classic gesture of the mafia's practice of sasso in bocca, stone in the mouth, police officers discovered a stone within Pecorelli's mouth as an announcement that the journalist never again would divulge a secret. Okay. So they literally left a calling card to like the guy that like is ratting out Gladio. Like Yeah, something also happens, and we've already covered it several times in some of these readings here, is people who are witnesses to Gladio operations who know about it and who try to investigate it, even people who are like totally unrelated. Uh, People who just investigate it from the outside are often killed. Sometimes their family is killed. Like it gets really bad. So this next section here is the Hyperion Language School. Let me just see how long. Okay, I'll read this one for like another 5 minutes. Good morning there, Shibbles. Good to see you in the chat. So the Hyperion Language School. The fact that the Red Brigades had been infiltrated by the CIA and the Italian Secret Services remains no longer contested. The purpose of the strategy of tension was to encourage violence from the radical left in order to convince the Italian people of the need to repress the rise of communism. Okay, so I guess here they're saying that the Red Brigades actually were responsible, but it was some element that either was part of the CIA itself or was prompted to do it by the CIA. So either way, it's a Gladio op. The brigades were a perfect foil. With unflinching radicalism, they considered the Italian Communist Party, the PCI, too moderate and Moro's opening too compromising. Thanks to the infiltration, which occurred in 1973, the brigades began to work closely with the Hyperion Language School in Paris, with most brigadiers unaware that it had been founded by the CIA. Hyperion opened an office in Italy shortly before the kidnapping and closed it a few months later. An Italian police report singles out Hyperion as, quote, the most important CIA office in Europe. Founded by Corrado Simeoni, a CIA operative who worked with Radio Free Europe, Duccio Berio, an informant to the P2 controlled Italian military intelligence, and Mario Moretti, the CIA operative who was later convicted of killing Aldo Moro. The quote school acted as an intermediary for meetings between Italian and foreign terrorist groups, including the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and the Red Army faction of Germany, and Euskadi ta Askatasuna, the Basque Revolutionary Army. I've never heard of that one. Sorry. I apologize for my butchering of the pronunciation. So the next section here is the Red Brigade Mystery. So yeah, it seems like these groups were all either heavily infiltrated or at least they were involved in this one, again, meeting place that ends up being this institution that is itself founded by the CIA and make sure that these left-wing groups do the CIA's bidding, even if they are genuinely operating out of goodwill. So again, the Red Brigade Mystery here is this next section. In 1974, 4 years before the kidnapping, Red Brigade founders Renato Curcio and Alberto Franceschini had been arrested in Rome. Franceschini immediately accused Mario Moretti of turning them in, stating that Moretti and Giovanni Cenzani, another leading Red Brigade member, were in fact CIA spies. From a military point of view, Franceschini told an Italian parliamentary commission, quote, those of you who know the people who were supposed to have carried out the Moro operation will be perfectly aware that they were not capable of it. Franceschini's testimony is supported by several facts. 1. The gunmen who mowed down Moro's bodyguards were highly trained assassins with skills that far exceed those of known brigadiers. 2. The assassins were obliged to wear Alitalia uniforms in order to identify each other. 3. Moro had been held captive in an apartment complex owned by SISMI, Italy's military agency. And 4. The bullets that riddled Moro's body were treated with a special preserving paint that characterized the ammunition found in the Gladio arms dumps. Yeah, there certainly are some bullets that have like paint on the tips. I've usually seen it on various different calibers will have it, but it is some kind of like preserving agent that keeps them from rusting. So, but if like you're known to be stocking these Gladio arms dumps, that's also another thing that's mentioned quite frequently here in this book is all these caches and dumps, depots of like grenades, explosives, guns, ammunition for the guns, cash, forged documents. They're all around Europe and Italy. They're in like caves, they're in churches, they're in all these places, and it's like a nationwide armory that is, again, supposedly to be ready for this Soviet invasion, but is actually used to carry out assassinations on left-wing figures. All right, so I'll read like one more paragraph here. We're almost done. We're switching over to the next book. In 1981, Moretti was arrested, apparently by accident, and eventually confessed to the kidnapping. He received 6 life sentences for the murder, but never cooperated with investigators. Costigo, when he became president of Italy in 1985, pressed for a pardon. Moretti was paroled after 15 years and presently resides in Milan. His early pardon by the Italian court has never been explained. So again, this Gladio operation has so many echoes and what do you call it, like reverberations that linger on throughout every aspect of government. The next section is Vatican pieces of the puzzle. Friar Felix Morleone, a Belgian priest, was affiliated with the Hyperion Language School and served to establish a branch of the quote school in Rome. During World War II, he had worked closely with Wild Bill Donovan. This is like one of the head CIA agents, and the Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA, by creating a pro Deo, a Catholic intelligence agency. When the Nazis seized control of Western Europe, Donovan relocated Morleone and his agency from Lisbon to New York. In 1945, the priest relocated to Rome, where he became the private emissary of Pope Pius XII and four of the Pope's successors. Throughout the 1960s, he remained a pivotal U.S. intelligence agent, as witnessed by his key role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. At JFK's urging, the Dominican priest had attended a strategic meeting in Andover, Massachusetts, where he established a communication channel between Moscow and Washington, mediated by Pope John the 23rd, through whom messages were passed that brought an end to the threat of nuclear war. This is crazy. Like I'd never heard of that at all. But you do often hear, even if you like look at any official or U.S. friendly accounting of the Cuban Missile crisis, they will talk about back channels. They will talk about these like secret avenues of communication that people like Kennedy and Castro would have had. But they never mentioned that they might go through the fucking Pope, because then that would start exposing Gladio. People would start asking a bunch of weird questions. I'm going to bookmark it there because we're about 20 minutes at this one. And then I will switch over now to the Western Marxism book. So again, Western Marxism, this is describing the bifurcation and the differences between the two versions of Marxism that exist in the world post World War II or post the Russian Revolution and the Chinese revolutions, which is that Eastern Marxism is the effective militant Marxism that exists in practice, and Western Marxism is the academic, performative, and the fake one, basically. I don't know how to say it better than that. So let's see. Consistent with this silence, at the moment of his break with Marxism and communism, Coletti outlined a disastrous account of the historical events initiated by the October Revolution without saying a word about the inspiration this event had given to the worldwide anti-colonial revolution. The crisis of Marxism, he observed in 1980, quote, dates from many decades ago. But to be exact, quote, a revolutionary Marxist like Karl Korsch had already identified it in 1931. He had identified it when the world colonialist system was still quite vigorous, so much so that Hitler proposed extending it to Eastern Europe to build the, quote, German Indies. Did the anti-colonial revolution that subsequently exploded on a planetary scale have something to do with Marxism and communism? It was a question completely absent in the work of the philosopher happily ensconced in the liberal capitalist world. And that is something that has been frequently reiterated throughout this book so far, is that the Western Marxists who live comfortably in the imperial core or some vassal state of the empire, who have their comfortable lifestyles built on that suffering of imperialism, are perfectly happy to level these critiques of Eastern Marxism, that it is not good enough, it's not perfect enough, while they continue to not build a better form of Marxism in the West. And then their critiques, always from whatever position they claim that they're from, even if they say they're from like the leftmost position, they end up serving the right, serving the capitalists, serving the fascists. Indeed, he mocked the interest that obstinate, incorrigible Marxists showed toward the quote underdeveloped countries and the quote peasants, the quote rural plebs, quote a subject not only extraneous to the Marxist tradition, but to which at least classical Marxism had often shown itself to be hostile. As if Marx had not dedicated a considerable part of his work to the struggle for liberation of the Irish and Polish peoples, each consisting in large part of peasants, and as if, together with Engels, he had not bitterly and repeatedly criticized the English working class for its substantial subordination to British colonialism. Ignored in particular was Marx's great thesis, quote, the profound hypocrisy and inherent barbarism of bourgeois civilization lies unveiled before our eyes, moving from its home, where it assumes respectable form, to the colonies, where it goes naked. Hell yeah. That's some fire from Marx right there. By reducing Marx to a critic of the quote respectable forms, assumed by capitalist dominion and by erasing the colonial question, Coletti had no difficulty in developing a Manichaean evaluation of the chapter of history that began with the October Revolution, a revolution, as Lenin noted, that had exploded on the scene to put an end to the war between slave owners for the consolidation and strengthening of colonial slavery. In the view of the philosopher finally converted to the ideals of the liberal and capitalist West, these ideals permanently embodied the cause of freedom and tolerance. Indeed, he does not fail to mention, quote, the massacre of more than 1 million communists in Indonesia, nor the, quote, bloodbath that followed the, quote, military coup in Chile, and the, quote, assassination of Allende in September 1973. In both cases, however, no reference was made to the role of the United States which had to destroy Third Worldism, of which the Indonesia of Sukarno, whom they took aim at in 1965, was a leading example. And to uphold the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America, no, the quote massacre and bloodbath were evoked, only to reiterate the failure of communism and Marxism, which cut a poor figure compared to the West, champion of the cause of freedom. So yeah, Rockhill and Losurdo will both. I mean, I guess it's written by Losurdo and translated and edited by Rockhill, but they um, they make these scathing critiques of all these Western philosophers and just point out their hypocrisy over and over again. It is a very common theme throughout this work. So this next section here is 3, workerism and the condemnation of third worldism. Disinterest in the colonial question can also be asserted and practiced in the name of a rigorous revolutionary theory and practice that, without letting itself be distracted by the countries of the periphery and by classes that, for the most part, are still linked to the pre-industrial world, instead concentrate on the capitalist metropoles and on the antagonist of class struggle par excellence, the working class. This is what happens in Italian operismo, or workerism, and in particular in the work of Mario Tronti. Quote, our workerism should be given credit for not falling into the trap of third worldism, of the countryside against the city, of the farmers' long marches. We were never Chinese. And that's just like so typical of the Western Marxists. Like anytime something goes wrong, be like, what are we, a bunch of Chinese people? What are we, a bunch of Asians? Meanwhile, it's like only Europeans and white people doing some of these horrible things. The founding text of Italian workerism made clear in unequivocal terms in the title Workers and Capital who the social subjects that interested Tronti were. We are in 1966 in Vietnam. The struggle for national liberation dared. Oh, sorry. We are in 1966 in Vietnam. The struggle for national liberation dared to challenge the mastodon-sized military apparatus of the United States, with which the year before had played a not to be forgotten role in the repression of Indonesia and the massacre of hundreds of thousands of communists during the defeat inflicted on the Third World militants in that country. In Latin America, the struggle against the Monroe Doctrine was fierce, and in the name of that doctrine, in 1961, the Kennedy administration attempted to invade and subjugate Cuba. In summary, the struggle between colonialism and anti-colonialism had exploded, and this contributed to feeding a crisis that, starting with installing Soviet missiles on the rebel island, pushed the world to the verge of a nuclear catastrophe. Without letting himself be distracted by all this, Tronti imagined, quote, Lenin in England, as the title of a central chapter of his book has it. Leaving behind a still scarcely developed Russia, the great revolutionary relocated himself to the center of the capitalist metropole, but not to analyze from within the British Empire, which was involved in one colonial war after another and was ready to battle for world hegemony, as quote, the country that exploits the whole world, as Engels called it, and because of which, according to Marx's denunciation, the very same working class, infected by the dominant ideology, considered and treated the Irish, inhabitants of a colony barbarically exploited and oppressed, as N-words. I guess he's quoting Marx there. No, instead, in England, Lenin was exclusively concerned with the factories and working conditions. In other words, the great revolutionary is here read as the kind of trade unionist he bitterly criticized. So he's like quite literally liberalizing Lenin against Lenin's own words. Instead of England in the 19th and 20th centuries, let's try to imagine Lenin in the United States in the 1960s. He would have found in the most developed capitalist country and leader of imperial and colonial oppression around the world, in the country where not a few times the workers and their unions threatened, and not only with words, students, often of bourgeois origins, protesting the draft and the war in Vietnam. However, from the theoretical point of view of workerism, Lenin should have only concerned himself with the working class. Tronti did not give up his search for a pure state of class struggle, and in a recent essay, 4 decades after the publication of Workers and Capital, he felt he could finally state that, quote, 1969 was the true annus mirabilis. In 1969, the issue wasn't anti authoritarianism, but anti capitalism. Workers and capital found themselves physically face to face with one another. Here, he refers not to England or the United States, but to Italy. It is worth noting that to find a class struggle in a pure state, Tronti was forced to have recourse to a country where the Communist Party exercised an enormous influence, thanks to the same political line of grand alliances that the theoretician of workerism did not in any way share. Yeah, that's something that we'll continually see again in all of these Western Marxist again thinkers, the writers, all the people who advocate for some different version of Marxism than the Russian and Chinese ones or the third world ones that actually toppled their oppressive systems. They're just totally hypocrites. They don't have any kind of coherent ideology. They just oppose anything that actually would threaten their privilege. However, there is no doubt that the autumn of 1969 saw great developments in workers' struggles. The workers were encouraged by and joined with a mass presence of students. Not a few of these were of bourgeois origin, and arrived at militant political activity starting precisely from the struggle against quote authoritarianism, identified and denounced first and foremost in the family and at school. Others underwent a process of political radicalization on the wave of protest against the barbaric war waged against Vietnam, and also from their enthusiasm for the effective resistance of an intrepid people against the gigantic military apparatus of their invaders. These were the years when, in Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, the anti colonial revolution, supported by the socialist countries, achieved brilliant success, and U.S. imperialism was in serious difficulty. It was a claim that made itself felt in Italy, where there was a communist party stronger than ever, to which a large part of the militants and leaders that organized the great popular and workers' struggles belonged. And again, you're going to find that all three of these books that I'm reading currently. Again, I already finished The Busy Worker's Handbook to the Apocalypse. That was a pretty good read about climate change and the upcoming apocalypse conditions that we should start to experience in the next 5 to 10 years. But especially these three books, they're very related. You're going to hear a lot about similar things to Operation Gladio in this book, and very much so in the Peter Dale Scott book. It's Drugs, Oil, and War. He talks a lot about Afghanistan, how the drug trade network that was created during Operation Gladio initially started out with heroin from Taiwan or from Laos, then moved on to heroin from Afghanistan, as we all know about the war in Afghanistan. Um, but at every turn, like throughout the decades, they have constantly used this same model of funding and clandestine operations to achieve their goals. No matter what government is actually in power, you're getting the fascist under government, basically. With a more attentive look, the class struggle, which in the eyes of Chante seemed to have finally achieved its pure form, reveals itself to have been nurtured from the start by the most diverse set of contradictions, including that of an anti colonial revolution. The polemic against the possible contaminations of the class struggle assumed militant tones. We have already seen the mockery of the campaign, quote, of the countryside against the city, of the farmers' long marches. Here, the greatest anti colonial revolution in history, which in China achieved success through the victory of the countryside, is the target of workerist sarcasm, along with one of its high points, which saw the revolutionaries led by the Communist Party march for thousands of kilometers under fire from reactionaries to fight the Japanese invasion that sought to enslave the Chinese people. This type of more or less workerist sarcasm is not new. Proudhon was likewise concerned with safeguarding the purity of the struggle between the poor and the rich, or between the victims and beneficiaries of the quote, theft that he considered property to be. He made fun of the struggles for national liberation of the Polish people oppressed by the Tsarist autocracy. Marx, who had founded the International Working Men's Association in 1865, dubbed this kind of mockery, quote, moronic cynicism. Yeah, it's literally what liberals do. Anything that they don't like, rather than admitting that they disagree with it because it is against their class interest or their personal privilege interests, they just say that it's impossible. They regard it with cynicism. They mock it. They don't take it seriously. And they benefit from the continuation of that privilege. as long as people are allowing them to continue to live that way. Which is why the communist move should not be to dialogue with liberals, but to take away their privilege by force. Tronti does not seem to have reflected on this page of the history of the workers' movement. Instead, he doubles down on the question, quote, the workers always they had to have a, quote, mission to complete, and it was always saving something. It had to be this mission: save the factory, save the country, save peace, save the people of the third world from imperialist aggression. It is not explained here what, for example, the Chinese workers should have done while their country was being invaded. Continue to make wage demands without worrying about the enslavement that loomed over them and their fellow citizens? The binary reading of social conflict, which sees only one contradiction between workers and capital, transforms this same contradiction into a prison marked by the most narrow minded corporatism. And this corporatism distorts the reading of history. The 20th century is, quote, the age of worldwide civil war. In this frame, the world anti colonial revolution has vanished, and it has vanished both as armed struggle and as economic struggle. While the countries that have achieved national independence sought to make that independence concrete and solid through the hard work of economic and technological development, workerism called for the, quote, workers' suppression of work. Yeah, and again, this all gets back to kind of laying the groundwork for why Western Marxists here feel content to denounce China, to denounce the DPRK, to denounce any existing socialist country uh, out of some kind of purist idealism. And it's because they oppose like work. Like they're often trying to do this thing where they achieve this utopian society where nobody has to work, and they're literally doing the like the anarchist meme of just like trying to have dessert before you have dinner, of like trying to skip right over to the dissolution of the state without any kind of transitional socialist state and get to the utopian idea of a stateless, moneyless, classless society, which is not even what communism is. Section 4, Althusser, Anti-Humanism, and Anti-Colonialism. However, even when it was cheered on and supported, the anti-colonialist revolution could be approached using categories that made it difficult to comprehend. Let's return to the, quote, barbaric discrimination between human creatures that Togliatti charged the capitalist colonialist system with. It was a denunciation that rang with humanism, and the humanism, as we shall see, was celebrated by Gramsci, but later on would be demonized by Louis Althusser. This thinker, unlike Tronti, could not pretend to never having been Chinese. The French philosopher referred repeatedly and positively to Mao Zedong, appreciating him most of all as a theoretician of contradictions and dialectics. It was an homage rendered to thought that had it was an homage rendered to thought that had matured, starting from what can be considered the greatest anti-colonialist revolution in history, one that saw the most populous country in the world and one with a millennia-old civilization confront theoretically and practically, and in a long struggle, multiple contradictions and enemies of diverse natures. However, Althusser undermines the homage to the world anti-colonialist revolution, then occurring with anti-humanist theorizing. This precludes comprehension of those class struggles that, far from being merely economic, are struggles for recognition. This is true especially for the struggles of colonial peoples and those of colonial origin, to the detriment of whom the dehumanization imposed by the capitalist imperialist system manifested in a particularly brutal way. That this is why, throughout contemporary history, the great tests of strength between abolitionism and slavery, between anti-colonialism and colonialism, saw ideologically the pathos of the universal concept of humanity on the one side and its negation and denigration on the other. These struggles saw, in other words, the confrontation between humanism and anti-humanism. Yeah. Definitely describing the nature of the class and anti-colonial struggle here. Almost at 40 minutes, so I'm going to read another paragraph here and then I'll switch over to the third book. At the end of the 18th century, Toussaint Louverture led the great revolution of black slaves, invoking the, quote, absolute adoption of the principle for which red, no man red, that is mulatto, black or white, may he be, can be the property of his kind. No matter how humble his condition, men cannot be, quote, confused with animals, as was the case under the system of slavery. On the other side, Napoleon, determined to reintroduce colonial domination and black slavery to Saint-Domingue or Haiti, proclaimed, quote, I am for the whites because I am white. There is no other reason beyond this, but this is good enough. That's like the perfect reasoning for all of white supremacists. They're literally just going by their skin color and the fake category that is race. And they will fight to the death to protect that, which should give you an idea of how to best deal with white supremacists. Let's move on to the English-speaking world now. A celebrated abolitionist poster showed a black slave in chains exclaiming, "Am I not a man and a brother?" A few decades later, while the colonial system was at its apogee, at the entrance to certain public parks in the US South, signs said, quote, "Entrance forbidden to dogs and Negroes," while in Shanghai, the French concession defended its purity by making quite visible signs reading, quote, "Entrance forbidden to dogs and Chinese." It was a phenomenon of worldwide dimensions, fully used to being considered N-words after the Great Revolt of Sepoys in 1857. The inhabitants of India in the spring of 1919 found themselves the subjects of a terrible humiliation. After making an essential contribution to Great Britain's victory in the First World War, they protested to demand, if not independence, some form of self-government. At Amritsar, the repression by the colonial power was distinguished by its brutality. It not only cost the lives of hundreds of unarmed protesters, it also required the inhabitants of the rebellious city to crawl on all fours to return home or to go out from their homes. Wild. Insane. Insane stuff. Insane, like, brutality and atrocities committed by white colonialists. Alright, so I'm going to switch over to the third book here. Again, this is Drugs, Oil, and War by Peter Dale Scott. So picking back up here. Other authors have made it clear that oil is an underlying U.S. concern in Afghanistan today. As NSC energy expert Shyla Heslin told Congress in 1997, U.S. policy in Central Asia was. Oh, sorry, I have to switch over my tab here. Sorry. U.S. policy in Central Asia was, quote, to in essence break Russia's monopoly control over the transportation of oil and gas from that region, and frankly, to promote Western energy security through diversification of supply. The same double goal of retrieval and denial was reiterated 1 year later by Energy Secretary Bill Richardson. Quote, "This is about America's energy security, which depends on diversifying our sources of oil and gas worldwide. It's also about preventing strategic inroads by those who don't share our values." Uh, Also worthy of noting, I just saw this, like, I believe it was yesterday or the day before. There's a popular Instagram page called We Have the Data, and it's very, like, neoliberal slash right wing oriented in its framing of all the things that it chooses to post and the way that it frames those things. But they posted yesterday like this graph showing that China is soaring above the U.S. in like energy production, and that also like even the neoliberal economists are basically saying that energy production is going to be the thing that defines a country's success or failure in the next century. So when even the neoliberals are saying that this is the Chinese century, uh, it's not looking good for the West, folks. American oil companies, including Unocal, have since 1995 been united in a private foreign oil companies group to lobby in Washington for an active U.S. policy to promote their interests in the Caspian Basin. Their meeting with Shyla Heslin in the summer of 1995 was followed shortly by the creation of an interagency governmental committee to formulate U.S. policy toward the Caspian. The conspicuous influence of petroleum money in the administration of oilmen George W. Bush and Dick Cheney was hardly less under their predecessors. This is also a big thing that happened, like, for people who are too young to have been around for the Bush presidency, the entire time. Everybody thought they were like some astute observer of political world affairs, and they had seen through the veil of deep politics by saying, "Oh, this is just a war for oil. They don't actually threaten us. 9/11 was bad, but we don't actually know who that was done by. But it certainly wasn't done by Afghanistan or Iraq." And so they would say, "This is all just an obvious war for oil." Which definitely it is a factor, but just the military-industrial complex and the need to control the Middle East and things like Israel are also parts of that. A former CIA officer complained about the influence of the oil lobby in the Clinton administration. Quote, Heslin's sole job, it seemed, was to carry water for an exclusive club known as the Foreign Oil Companies Group, a cover for a cartel of major petroleum companies doing business in the Caspian. Another thing I learned was that Heslin wasn't soloing. Her boss, Deputy National Security Advisor Sandy Berger, headed the Interagency Committee on Caspian Oil Policy, which made him, in effect, the government's ambassador to the cartel. And Berger wasn't a disinterested player. He held $90,000 worth of stock in Amoco, probably the most influential member of the cartel. That doesn't seem like that much, but whatever, I don't know. The deeper I got, the more Caspian oil money I found sloshing around Washington. This next section here is heroin in Afghanistan. In the same period that U.S. interest in Afghanistan surged, Afghanistan became the world's major heroin source. Indeed, one might have thought when the United States attacked Afghanistan in October 2001, it would be proclaimed as another chapter in the U.S. quote, war on drugs. Both bin Laden and the Taliban had been named abroad as financed from the drug traffic. Russia submitted a detailed report on this and other aspects of the Taliban to the UN Security Council in March 2001. But the United States, according to June's intelligence review, chose not to act on this information. They also mention here in this book a lot Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He's this notorious character who was at one point the biggest drug trafficker in Afghanistan, and he was a US CIA asset. He was aided and abetted by them at every turn. Instead, there was for a while a virtual embargo in the United States on this aspect of bin Laden's Al Qaeda network that was being widely reported in France, England, and Canada. That Al Qaeda itself earned ongoing revenues from not only a spectrum of legitimate businesses, but also drug trafficking. And yet, as I wrote in September 2001, I could find only one sentence on this topic in a US paper, buried deep in a long story in the Los Angeles Times. Quote, CIA officials say the underground network frequently crosses into gangsterism. One official cites, quote, ample evidence that bin Laden's group uses profits from the drug trade to finance its campaign. Followers also have been tied to bank robberies, holdups, credit card fraud, and other crimes. Gradually, the reason for U.S. silence became clear. We were about to use the Northern Alliance, which had just tripled opium production in the area it controlled, as a drug proxy to defeat the Taliban, which had just enforced a total ban on opium production. Yeah, and this is another thing that people figured out like 20, 25 years too late. Like after the Afghanistan war ended, after like Biden pulled everybody out, and then opium production in Afghanistan stopped again because the Taliban took control. People make the connections again way too late, and they label everybody a conspiracy theorist if you pointed out at the time. So it's kind of how this thing works. CIA collaboration with and support for Islamists like bin Laden date back at least to 1971, when the CIA joined Saudi intelligence in backing the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies in a worldwide campaign against communism. During the Afghanistan resistance to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, bin Laden became the financier and logistics expert in Afghanistan for the Saudi financed Maktab al-Khidmat, the Office of Services, an organization that, through the Muslim Brotherhood, recruited foreign volunteers from all over the world, including the United States. I forgot all about the Muslim Brotherhood. That was another thing you only heard of like back during the W. Bush presidency. There are repeated allegations that the CIA, directly or through intermediaries, assisted this recruitment campaign. Simon Reeve also heard from a retired CIA officer that U.S. emissaries to Pakistan, quote, met directly with bin Laden, and that it was bin Laden acting on advice from his friends in Saudi intelligence, who first suggested that the Mujahideen should be given stingers. Yeah, early on in this book, he talks about the Stinger missiles often being touted as the turning point in Afghanistan for the Soviets, but it really was not the case, as explained in like the beginning of the introduction of this book. French and Italian newspapers have alleged a contact between bin Laden and a CIA officer as late as July 2001. It is striking that with all the press focused on bin Laden, no newspaper to my knowledge quoted from his 1999 biography by Joseph Bodansky, director of the U.S. Congressional Task Force on Terrorism, quote, an up-and-coming venue for Islamist funds is a combination of the former Soviet states of Central Asia with Germany and Eastern Europe. Access to the seemingly unrelated group of states was made possible through bin Laden's building of relations with the Russian mafia. This connection is becoming extremely important with the vast expansion of the Afghan drug trade. As the sums of money available from the drug trade have increased, bin Laden and the Russian mafia have established yet another complex money laundering operation. These funds are used to finance the Taliban movement and a host of Islamist terrorist operations. Bin Laden makes a commission on the transactions, which is laundered by the Russian mafia in countries other than Russia and Afghanistan. Why, in this situation, did the United States and its dutiful media not proclaim a war on drugs? Because the primary U.S. target at first was not bin Laden, but the Taliban, who by 2001 had already responded to U.S. and UN demands that they halt opium cultivation. As June's intelligence review, October 22, 2001, noted, quote, the ban imposed by the Taliban Supreme Leader, Mullah Muhammad Omar, in July 2000, resulted in some 70% of the world's illicit opium production being wiped out at virtually a stroke. That's crazy. So centralized power actually does work, folks. Hierarchy actually can accomplish great change overnight. Other drug proxy allies were the Northern Alliance, who responded to the Taliban ban on opium cultivation in 2000 by tripling output in their sector of northeastern Afghanistan. It's a typo here, it's tripling. They keep doing that. The United States was not waging a war on drugs, in short, but a war helped by drugs. That's a great sentence. That describes so much of the entire quote war on drugs. It is true that previously the Northern Alliance had controlled less than 5% of the Afghan opium traffic, compared to the Taliban's 75 to 80%. But even before the onset of the US bombing, that was changing. In October 2001, June's Intelligence Review, October 22nd, 2001, reported that while, quote, poppy cultivation has almost totally disappeared from the areas of Afghanistan under Taliban control, quote, a rising tide of narcotics, both opium and the heroin refined from it, was flooding out of the northeast corner of Afghanistan under the control of the Northern Alliance. So, yeah, wherever the enemies of the US control is not producing opium, and wherever the US assets control is producing tons of opium. What a coincidence. Add that to the stories of all the mercenaries and private contractors who said that their job was to protect poppy fields in Afghanistan. A subsequent article in the London Observer attributed the shift in opium supplies to the ban on cultivation enacted by the Taliban in 2000. Quote, during the ban, the only source of poppy production was territory held by the Northern Alliance. It tripled its production. In the high valleys of the Badakhshan area, or the Badakhshan, an area controlled by troops loyal to the former president Burhanuddin Rabbani, the number of hectares planted last year jumped from 2,458 to 6,342. Alliance fields accounted for 83% of total Afghan production of 185 tons of opium during the ban. Now that the alliance has captured such rich poppy growing areas as the Nangarhar, production is set to rocket. In short, the U.S. military intervention in Afghanistan in 2001 was accompanied by a restoration of opium for the world market, a recreation of what happened with the earlier U.S. intervention of 1979 to 80, and before that, with the U.S. intervention in Indochina after 1959, and in Southeast Asia in 1950. So these are not coincidences, folks. Wherever the U.S. invades, the opium production kicks back up. We can conclude once again that as a Brookings Institution expert wrote of the U.S. intervention of 1979 to 80, quote, drug control evidently became subordinated to larger strategic goals. Yes, they need the drug money. The U.S. and its drug enforcement agencies and its intelligence agencies are aided and abetted by the military in facilitating that drug trafficking because they need the money from that to fund all their other secret operations. If you think the military budget is big, wait until you find out about the secret military budget funded by drug trafficking. Let's see. Sorry, I gotta block one of these idiots here. Shubal says horns, yeah. And it says Western Marxists sound like fake Christians. Yeah, going back to the other book. Shubal also says, I saw somewhere that China produces more solar in 1 month than countries do in an entire year. Yeah, talking about the energy production again. Like it's insane. Like China has also been responsible for more combating of climate change through like greening of deserts and renewable energy production than the rest of the world combined. So I'll do another 6 or 7 minutes here on this book. So this next chapter here is chapter 2, Indochina, Colombia, and Afghanistan, Emerging Patterns. As in Afghanistan in the 1980s or Laos in the 1960s, our principal proxy in the 2001 to 2002 Afghan war was a dominant element in the regional drug traffic. In Colombia also, we are fighting a war, supposedly on drugs, but in fact financed in part by drugs, with a drug proxy, the corrupt Colombian army, and its even more corrupt paramilitary auxiliaries. In 2001, Colombian government sources estimated that 40% of Colombian cocaine exports were controlled by right-wing paramilitary warlords and their trafficking allies. Meanwhile, the amount controlled by the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, the target of the U.S. quote, war on drugs, was estimated by the Colombian government to be 2.5%. So yeah, if that's not typical for the U.S., they're going to go after the left-wing militants that apparently control 2.5% of the drug production, and then totally ignore or actually really help and facilitate the right-wing militants that control 40%. The oil aspect of the Colombian conflict is also conspicuous. The origins of the current U.S. presence in Colombia can be traced back to 1984, 1 year after the discovery by Occidental Oil of the billion-barrel Cayo Limon oil field in 1983. A concerted U.S. propaganda campaign was mounted in 1984 against alleged drug trafficking by a conspiracy involving Nicaraguan Sandinistas, Colombian narco guerrillas, and traffickers in Medellin, notably Carlos Leder and Pablo Escobar. This campaign distorted the truth in two related aspects. It falsely implicated the FARC and it rewrote history to efface references to the Medellin cartel's competitors in Cali, who were closer to the army and national security apparatus. But it led to the National Security Decision Directives of 1986 and 89 that created a U.S. military presence in Colombia. Consider also the pattern of drugs and oil that emerged in Southeast Asia following the victory of the Chinese Revolution and the exile of the Kuomintang to Taiwan. The U.S. drug proxies in Laos, including the Hmong, Laotian, and former KMT armies, were all major drug traffickers. The KMT were also principal agents in building up Laotian drug production, from an estimated 50 tons in 1953 to 100 to 150 tons in 1968. Okay, so again, that's just making clear the direct through line of all of these conflicts the U.S. is involved in, whether they're saying they're trying to prevent the spread of communism, to liberate people from dictators, whatever it is that they say they're doing, they're actually protecting and facilitating the drug trafficking routes that they need for their funding, in addition to the oil. Oil, especially the offshore oil deposits of the South China Sea, helps explain the general U.S. interest in Southeast Asia. In the speeches of Americans like Nixon who defended or lobbied for an increased U.S. presence in the region, the U.S. presence in Vietnam, as in SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, before it, was defined as the, quote, shield protecting anti-communist forces in Indonesia. One of the most industrious of such lobbyists was William Henderson, who was simultaneously an officer of the American Friends of Vietnam and an advisor on international affairs to Sukoni Mobile, a major oil investor in Indonesia. The 1970 U.S. incursion into Cambodia followed aerial surveys of Cambodian offshore waters by U.S. Navy planes, following which Union Oil of California, now Unocal, established in Thailand by 1963, acquired a concession for all onshore Cambodian oil and much offshore oil as well. Funny how that works. This next session here is called The Underlying Patterns. Appreciate you, Shibbles. Thank you for sticking around. Dramatic boost to international drug trafficking, including a rise in U.S. drug consumption with each war. When the CIA began its covert involvement in Burma in the early 1950s, local opium production was in the order of 80 tons a year. 10 years later, thanks to KMT warlords supported by CIA and Civil Air Transport, later Air America, the region produced 300 to 400 tons a year. During the Vietnam War, production at one point reached 1,200 tons a year. By 1971, there were also 7 heroin labs in the region, one of which close to the forward CIA base in Ban Hoi Sai, I'm not really sure how to say that, sorry you guys, in Laos, was estimated to produce 3.6 tons of heroin a year. With the waning of the Vietnam War, opium production in the Golden Triangle also declined. In the case of Laos, it plummeted from 200 tons in 1975 to 30 tons in 1984. Heroin consumption in the United States also declined. Although the decline in Laotian production has been attributed to drought conditions, a related factor was clearly the increase in cultivation in the so-called Golden Crescent along the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, from 400 tons in 1971 to 1,200 tons in 1978. This coincided with a number of political developments in the region, including an increase in Pakistani support for Afghan Islamic resistance movements following a left-wing Afghan coup in 1973. The decline in U.S. heroin consumption also occurred in the context of an increase in other areas, notably Europe and Australia. In the case of Australia, the first major drug imports were financed by the Nugan Hand Bank, organized in part by veterans of U.S. Special Forces and CIA in Laos. The bank combined drug financing with arms deals and support for CIA covert operations in other regions, such as Africa. The Australian surge occurred just as Richard Nixon inaugurated a, quote, war on drugs to keep opium and heroin from reaching the United States. The U.S. military intervention in Colombia has also been accompanied, as I predicted in 1991, by a dramatic increase in cocoa production, from 3.8 to 12.3 thousand hectares between 1991 and 1999. These boosts are cumulative and up to now not permanently reversible. The U.S. Bureau of Narcotics reported in 1970 that annual illicit opium production at that time was between 1,250 and 1,400 tons, more than half of it coming from the Golden Triangle of Burma, Laos, and Thailand, which before World War II accounted for about 47 tons. In 1999, the United Nations put the opium production of Afghanistan alone at 4,600 tons, or 70% of the world's crop. Yeah, just before the invasion, just before 9/11 in 1999. That's how much Afghanistan was producing. So it's crazy stuff, you guys. I'm going to do like one more paragraph here and then we'll call it a day. The strengthening of the global narcotics traffic has fueled other smuggling and related criminal activities, leading to the consolidation of an international criminal milieu. Chinese triads, Japanese yakuza, Russian gangs, and the mafias of Italy, America, and Colombia have now combined into a quote, worldwide criminal consortium that is, according to experts, growing exponentially. Delegates to a global crime conference in November 1994 were informed that organized crime generates $750 billion annually. Many of these illicit dollars end up corrupting markets, institutions, businessmen, and of course politicians. Writing in 1997 of his experience in exposing the BCCI, Senator John Kerry concluded that, quote, today, globalized crime can rob the U.S. not only of our money, but also of our way of life. Oddly wise words from Senator John Kerry. All right, so I'm going to bookmark this one here, and then we'll pick back up on them tomorrow. But again, if you guys want to catch up on all the previous streams, just go to youtube.com/@TCOTEpod/streams. So again, if you're just catching up, True Crimes of the Empire was the new podcast for Turn Leftist podcast listeners. Since the Turn Leftist podcast ended a couple of years ago at this point, and we kind of lingered along for a little while. And then I started True Crimes of the Empire, and then that has also now fizzled out. Not any particular reason other than that it just was a lot of effort. I don't know if anyone... I released all the Patreon episodes. They were like the full-length episodes that included all the current events talk at the beginning, but to edit that show was an immense effort, and it simply was not generating the amount of attention and garnering the attention that I would consider worth spending that amount of time and effort on. There's a common term, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like regressing to streaming or regressing to the mean or something, and it's related to people who make social media content of any form. Basically, everyone keeps regressing to streaming because it is the easiest way to produce some kind of content people can consume and doesn't require any editing, doesn't require any of this other post-production. So thank you all for joining me. If you did, hopefully you guys all like it, and I'll start putting this out on the regular podcast feed. But again, you can catch up on all the previous ones on the YouTube channel or on the Patreon for $1 a month if you'd like the audio format in your podcast feed. Thank you all again.